All right, hello biology humans and welcome to another biology video. This one, as you can see, is about food webs and energy pyramids, but it's really about is about energy. And so let's start with a slide that we saw before. Where am I putting my head now? Where we were comparing ecosystems, right? And I asked this question about why do the different ecosystems have different levels of biodiversity? And I brought your attention to things like rainfall and sunlight and temperatures, as you can see. But many of you already had guessed at what I was getting at because rainfall and sunlight and the temperature has a lot to do with photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is about plants. And so you said that rainforests have a high biodiversity because there's a lot of plants, and deserts have a low biodiversity because they have very few plants, and forests are right there in the middle, right? And so the reason that, again, I wanted to bring this up is that to remind you that the abiotic factors like rainfall and sunlight and temperatures are what control the biotic factors, which then control the rest of the whole ecosystem, right? So in a rainforest, which has very steadily high temperatures, being shown by this red line at the top, and a seasonal but still very high levels at all the seasons of precipitation, as shown by the bars here, in stark contrast to the desert, which has relatively variable temperatures. Most of the time we think of deserts as being very hot, but in the winter they can get very cold. But they do have very consistently low precipitation. And then finally, the forest has variable temperatures and variable rainfall, but still a decent amount throughout the year to get an average amount of biodiversity, right? But in the end, it's all about the plants. All of the energy on the earth comes from the sun and is absorbed, transferred from solar energy into chemical energy via photosynthesis. But now in this video, we'll talk about how does that energy move through the ecosystem? How does it get to all the other organisms? And how do plants support the entire ecosystem? And that's through eating and through this thing that we're going to see called an energy pyramid. And so the plants are the bottom of the pyramid, because plants are something called autotrophs or producers. This is a word, autotroph, that we don't hear too much. It's a very sciencey word. To break that word down, though, it means self-eater or self-energy. The auto part means self, and troph means energy or eater or food, right? So an autotroph is a self-eater. And again, that's kind of maybe a weird thing to think about. But if you remember back to the photosynthesis video, the plants are making glucose for themselves. They're making sugar so that they can use it. So if we get our energy from eating plants or eating sugar, then plants are eating their own sugar. So they're a self-eater. I say plants, but I also don't want to forget about the algae, bacteria, photosynthetic bacteria, the green stuff that lives in ponds and in the ocean, does a vast amount of the photosynthesis on the planet, actually more than the land plants do. Right? So they are the bottom of the ecosystem because they are the ones that can eat the air and the sunlight. Right? Everything else is called heterotroph. The hetero part means other, just like heterosexual means people that prefer the other sex. Other eater or other energy, you have to get your energy from someplace other than yourself. These are also known as consumers, as you can see. But heterotroph is the more sciencey word and the one that you are the least familiar with, probably. Right? So heterotrophs, there are multiple categories of these. As you have heard of these words before, I'm sure: herbivore and carnivore and omnivore. But most of the time we think of, you were taught maybe that herbivores eat plants, right? But what about something that eats algae? Algae isn't technically a plant, but it is a producer. So herbivores eat producers as a more general term. Carnivores, same thing. You were taught that carnivores eat meat. But what does that say about an animal that eats things like grasshoppers, right? The grasshopper isn't exactly meat. But an organism that eats a grasshopper is a heterotroph. It is eating another consumer. And so carnivores in general eat consumers. And then omnivores eat everything. They eat producers and consumers. And so throughout this video, actually, we'll talk a lot about herbivores and carnivores. Just remember that omnivores kind of could take the place of either of those at any time. Now, to practice this, there is a worksheet, a Google Doc that looks like this. And at the top, it has 12 organisms found in a wetland ecosystem in general. Now, right off the bat, I will tell you that myself and some biology teachers a long time ago made this up, and some of the things on here are only for this particular activity. I didn't go particularly researching any of these animals. I just used my general knowledge, which could be faulty. But the idea here is that each of these organisms, it tells you what they eat or don't eat. And your job is to then go through the bottom part here. And for every organism, write down, is it a producer or a consumer based on the information given? And then if it is a consumer, then to fill out, is it an herbivore, carnivore, or omnivore? You don't have to put anything if it is a producer, because we don't have to get into the different types of producers, right? So please do that now. All right, let's move ahead again. So after going through the table, the first thing you have to do is figure out if it's a producer or a consumer. And the easiest way to know that is to ask yourself, does it eat? And so you look on there on the worksheet, and you'll notice that eating happens a lot. And everything that eats is a consumer. So there's all these consumers, right? All these things that eat, which leaves only the other two as producers, and these are the ones that said energy source rather than saying eating, because it's not eating anything technically. So the algae and the plants are the producers. Then you had to go through and look and see what type of consumer they were. So this is where you had to get in a little more detail. So for the mouse, you had to look through and see it eats grasshoppers, snails, which are both consumers, but then it eats plants, which is a producer, which would make the mouse an omnivore. The hawks eat shrews, mice, and rats, and so those are all consumers, which would make the hawk a carnivore. Now, the grasshopper, I made it only eats salt marsh plants. I do believe that if a grasshopper came across a smaller insect that it could get its hands on, claws on, it would eat it. But in this case, I said that they only eat plants, which would make them an herbivore. The rat, I said the rat would eat grasshoppers, snails, and plants, and mice. I don't know if a rat would really eat a mouse, but I do know that rats can get rather large, and mice are rather small, and rats are kind of vicious. So who knows? I don't know where I got that idea. This was a long time ago when I made it. The duck also, I said, eats crustaceans, grasshoppers, and snails. That would make a duck a carnivore, and I don't think a duck is really what you think of as being a carnivore. I know, though, that when I researched this, that some duck species do only eat other consumers, while some do eat algae and things like that. So it depends on which kind of duck you're talking about. A sandpiper is a small bird that lives on the shore, and I said it eats crustaceans and algae, which makes it an omnivore. The owl is definitely a carnivore. Owls eat other animals. The shrew is like a kind of a weird looking mouse. And I said it ate grasshoppers, snails, and mice, which is a carnivore. Again, I don't know if a shrew would eat a mouse. I don't know where I was getting these ideas before. The smallest crustacean, which would be like a little clam type thing maybe, or a mussel. I said that they eat saltwater algae. Then you get to the two producers, so you skip them, and then you get to the snail, which I said eats plants and algae, which is an herbivore. Right? So here we go with categorizing things. Now, this is, believe it or not, going to come in handy later as we go through the worksheet. Now, how do we track all this? With something called a food chain. I don't know where I'm going to put my head this time. Food chain is a single straight pathway of energy. Usually they go with the following pattern, but it can be various versions of this. Autotroph producer has got to be at the beginning. That part is non-various. Then some sort of consumer is going to be there, which is usually an herbivore, could be an omnivore. Then you get consumer, carnivores, omnivores could be eating carnivores, carnivores could be eating omnivores. There's all kinds of different combinations. The producer part, though, is super important, has to be at the beginning. So here's an example of grass as my producer being eaten by my rabbit as a consumer, which is the herbivore, and then the fox, which is the carnivore that eats the herbivore, right? Very simple food chain, one straight pathway. Now, it's important that the arrows go in a particular direction. The arrows must go from the thing being eaten towards the thing that is eating. Because remember, we are trying to show how energy is moving. The energy was in the grass and it's now in the rabbit. Every once in a while, I'll get a student who draws the arrow going that way from the rabbit to the grass. And I think I see where they're going with it. They think, oh, the rabbit goes over to eat the grass. And they're like showing movement of the animal or something. But when you draw me an arrow that goes from the rabbit to the grass, you're telling me that the grass ate the rabbit. And I don't know what kind of weird carnivorous grass you are hanging out with, but I don't want to know about it. And that's not usually the way it happens, right? Arrows go from the thing being eaten to the thing that is doing the eating. Another example would be if acorns were eaten by a mouse. I don't know why I chose mouse instead of squirrel. It makes more sense to do squirrel, which is eaten by an owl, right? So we have our producer being eaten by the herbivore, being eaten by the carnivore. But things are rarely that simple. In reality, are foxes the only thing that are going to eat rabbits? No. Owls will also eat rabbits. Are rabbits the only thing that the foxes will eat? No, that is not true either. The foxes will definitely eat the mice. So what we end up with is something more like a food chain. And I think this is why I chose these animals, like acorns and mice, because this picture had those animals in it. A food web combines all the food chains. It shows all possible energy pathways, right? And so there are a lot of different interactions that are being shown. And food webs do get complicated pretty quickly, but they show all the possible food chains. So how many food chains are there in this particular image? All right, so starting with the acorns. There's the acorns. Oop, don't go do that. The acorns to the mouse to the fox. That's one. Acorns to the mouse to the owl. That's two. The grass to the mouse to the fox is three. Grass, mouse, owl's four. Grass, rabbit, fox is five. Grass, rabbit, owl is six. There are 6 different food chains inside of this food web. And again, the more animals you add, the more and more complicated and larger that number will get, because there's all these different ways for the energy to move, which of course is more realistic. And we're working our way towards even more realistic food webs soon. Now, got to practice this. So on your worksheet, there's 2 different parts. You want to draw 2 different food chains. And when I mean say draw, maybe you're going to draw it and like take a picture of it and then upload it into the document, which could be cool. Or you could just make text boxes with arrows in that sense. So you need to make 2 different ones that have 4 organisms from the first side, right? Or from the front one. So all those same 12 organisms you're choosing from. And then you need to use all of them, all 12 organisms, into one big food web. So go ahead and do that now. Now, you should be done. And so for the food chain part, maybe you did something like this: the algae to the crustacean, to the duck, to the owl, showing the energy moving from one to the next. There again are lots of different options. The only thing that really has to be there is the producer at the bottom. And then there's got to be an herbivore as your second one, but could be an omnivore, I guess. So the algae or the plants have got to be the beginning, and then from there, it's up to you. Now, as far as the bigger food web, maybe yours looks something like this. This is the part where everybody's looks very different because everyone starts in a different spot, and many of you are just going one at a time, and then you realize that, oh man, I should have put this one over here and this other one over there, so it gets really crazy with arrows going all across each other, and that is okay. I mean, we want to have it as readable as possible, but as long as you have everything, that's all right. But as you would get better at this, after you practice it a few times, you start to realize that there is a way to make it more organized. And you start to notice that, for example, that the algae and the plants, those are both the producers, and so you could kind of like group them together maybe. And so one general rule is that if you start with the producers and then you put them at the bottom of your page, and then always have the arrows go up. And so whenever something eats one of the producers, it's the next thing right above it on the paper. And so if you do that, you end up with something like this that looks a little bit more organized, right? Because at some point, again, you realize that the plants and the algae are kind of functioning in the same way, and the grasshoppers, snails, and crustaceans are operating kind of in the same way, and then the ducks and so forth. And you start to notice there's these groups. Maybe you didn't notice them, but I'm helping you to notice it now, that these groups exist. And so obviously ecologists and scientists have realized that these groups exist too. And there is what's called the energy pyramid, or a trophic pyramid. And I don't know where I'm going to put my head this time. Right at the bottom are the producers, but above them are the consumers. But it's not just any consumers. These are the first consumers to eat, the first in the chain. And so that's called the primary consumer. Again, also known as herbivores, but could be an omnivore, which is why there's a more general term called primary consumer. Then the herbivores are usually eaten by a carnivore, another consumer. It's the second consumer in line, and so that's called the secondary consumer. They're also known as carnivores. Then the next level up is called the tertiary consumer, which is a word maybe you've never heard before, but tertiary means third. You can call it third level. I'm okay with that. Third level consumer. And then you could go up even farther. The furthest I've ever seen one go, or that we're going to encounter, would be a quaternary consumer for fourth level consumer. There's like the quintiary consumer, I think it's called, for the fifth level. And then who knows what kind of weird words come after that. Sixth level and so forth. Right? So you definitely do need to know these words: producer, primary, consumer, secondary, and so forth like that. The tricky thing here is that producers kind of throw off the pattern that you might be thinking on some sort of lab or test. It might ask you, what's the third level of the pyramid? And you would say, oh, it's the tertiary consumer, but then you would have counted wrong, because the third level is right here. The third level is the secondary consumer, because those producers ended up being the bottom level, right? So maybe the producers you could think of as the zero level. So the third level overall is actually the secondary consumer. That does get a little tricky, so that's why I'm letting you know about it right now. Now, where am I going with this? Oh, I remember now. It's a pyramid. Why are we making it a pyramid? How come it's not the trophic square or rectangle? That is because energy is an interesting thing. Energy gets, some other things popped up. I'm ahead of myself. I've been using this word, but maybe it needs to be on the screen. It's called trophic level. So sorry to get ahead of myself. Now let's continue with this whole triangle versus rectangle idea. Energy has to go somewhere. And of course, the reason why these animals and plants are eating, that they're taking in energy, is that they need to live. And so there's a cost associated with living. A lot of that cost comes from something called cellular respiration. This is something that we're going to talk about very soon. Cellular respiration is how you release the energy in your food, right? This is the energy required to run your body, to keep everything moving, to power your movement, but also your heartbeat or anything that needs to happen. And there's all kinds of chemical reactions that need energy, right? So you eat to keep yourself going. Now, 50% of that is also considered waste, which might seem like a lot, but what you don't consider most of the time is the heat, right? Like, definitely we waste some things. There's all kinds of stuff that you put into your body that cannot be digested, and it just comes right back out. But the heat is something that's unavoidable. There is no such thing as a completely efficient energy transfer. Whenever energy gets moved from one place to another, there's always some of it lost as heat. Now, for a human and other mammals, warm-blooded, and birds, warm-blooded animals, this is more obvious because our bodies are at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius. Our bodies are pumping out almost 100 degrees of heat at all times, right? That is a lot of heat that is just going out there. And so a lot of the energy the food you eat, the energy from the food you eat gets used to heat you up. And then that gets lost. Of course, reptiles and fish and amphibians, they don't lose as much heat, but they do still have some heat signature to them. And even plants have a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of heat that comes out of them all the time. So in the end, 40% used to live, 50% wasted. That leaves hold 10% for something called growth. This is basically to build your body, right? It's stored in your muscles. It's stored in the shell of the bug. It's stored in the muscles of the cow or the fish or whatever you're eating. Or it could be stored in the form of starch in the plant, right? But this is the only part that you get, right? When you eat the plant, you didn't get all the sugar that the plant used. When you eat the hamburger, you don't get the energy that the cow has already used to like keep itself going for however long it was alive before it got to you, right? All you got was what was left inside of the molecules of its body, which is only 10% of the total energy that went into that body, because a lot of it got used or wasted, right? And so this is called the 10% rule, although the number does change based on what species and which ecosystem and all this stuff. But 10% is a general rule, right? And so let's put some numbers, and maybe that'll make it a little easier. Let's say that the plants have 10,000 joules of energy. The J stands for joules. It's just a unit of energy. Call it 10,000 pieces of energy. Due to the 10% rule, only 10% of that's going to make it to the next level. So that would mean that there is only 1,000 joules of energy available in the bodies of the snails and the flies and the tiny little fish. Where did the other 9,000 joules of energy go? It went to being used and wasted. So then when the minnows there are going to eat the snails or the fly larvae, only 100 joules is going to be there, right? Because the snails used up the other energy. Then when the big fish eats the little fish, oh, my head blocked it. Where are we going to go? Oh, there's no good place for my head as usual. Now the big fish can only have 10 joules of energy in it. And then it's going to spend 9 joules of that, and then that only leaves 1 joules left for the hawk. And then the hawk's going to use as much of that as it can to keep its body going. And so at some point you get to such a small amount of energy that there isn't any animal that could really live above that, right? And so at some point you reach the peak of the pyramid as the energy is just gone. So the more energy that you put into the bottom, the more levels you can get above it, right? And so some ecosystems, some food chains or food webs in the aquatic ecosystems in the ocean, they can get 6 or 7 or 8 levels because there's just so much algae and plankton out there available. But then maybe in the desert you only get 3 levels because there's so few plants to only support a few herbivores and a few carnivores above them, right? And so that leads to one last idea here, that the energy pyramid also kind of shows the number of organisms. It's called also known as a biomass pyramid, not period, pyramid. Here we have the units are kilograms, right? So like if you could weigh all the grasses and then you could weigh all the grasshoppers, you would find that there's only 10% of the weight in the grasshoppers as the grass. And again, this should hopefully make sense that there should be more grass out there than, say, cows, and more cows out there than wolves. And there's nothing really eats wolves. So let's just go with the one here that's on the screen where the grasses and the grasshoppers and mice and snakes, right? There's more mice than snakes out there, and there should be more grasshoppers than mice as you go through the ecosystem. And so here then is the last part of the worksheet. To practice this idea, you're going to take all those 12 organisms from the front side that you made the food web from, and then you're going to put them into the appropriate level on the energy pyramid, and then label each level as primary, secondary, tertiary, or quaternary, or producer. Right, so go ahead and do that now. All right, and so I'll bring you back to this diagram I had before, because I kind of already did this when you organize the food web in such a way that you always write the thing that's doing the eating directly above the thing that's being eaten, then you pretty much get the right idea. You have to move things up and down a little bit. But if I overlay the pyramid on here, then you can see the levels right there, and I can label them like so, right? So again, if yours doesn't look just like this, that's all right. Hopefully that makes sense now, which is the reason for doing the practice, right? And so to wrap it all up, to sum it all up, The energy comes in from the sun, and then it basically enters the bottom of the pyramid and works its way up. And as one thing eats the next, the energy gets passed to one trophic level to the next trophic level. And at the whole time, the energy is being lost as heat coming out of the system at all the different levels until there's no energy left because it's all been used up or lost as heat. And that's the energy flow through an ecosystem.